So I thought I'd share just a little bit kind of, I guess, of some of my motivations too for what brought me to science and kind of what brought me here in part of this story. And I don't have quite as good of a story as Todd, but I'll try and weave a little bit of a tale anyway. So I will say this is a picture I often like to show, and hopefully, can you guys see this guy?
Great.
Awesome. So I show this because this picture is kind of growing up, you know, the vision of a scientist, I think, that I often got exposed to. I think back to early on, one of my first experiences in science was sitting in our elementary school gymnasium watching, you know, the movie play of The Nutty Professor, you know, so there's this black and white movie. You know, I was probably in grade 2 or 3 at the time. And, you know, that is this kind of guy, right? A guy who made flubber. And it kind of made me be like, wow, science is pretty cool. It seems like a pretty neat kind of thing. And I think one of the things that got me going forward a lot was really thinking about, you know, well, why do things work the way they do? You know, how do they work? And so I always asked a lot of questions. This isn't so much about creativity, I guess, as Todd's, but you know, one of the things that growing up, like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this or remember this, but it's called The Little Professor. And this was one of the Christmas presents I got one year because I was always asking questions and people started saying, oh, you're like going to be a professor. You know, we had no history of that in my family for sure. But from a pretty early age, I was being told I was going to be a professor one day. And so I think, you know, thinking early on, I kind of came this way, but very much, you know, I think what I've grown into is something much more like this. This is actually a picture of me working with villagers in India on a project we had working on sustainable water resources and thinking about kind of what we can do, you know, how we work with people, how we apply science in really meaningful ways and kind of discover neat and interesting things. And so just to give you a little more about my background, you know, I come from a background in water, but also geophysics. And so this is an example of the kind of work we do out in the field where we're actually, all of those little yellow things are radar antennas, and we're shooting radar down into the ground to actually image what's underground and understand how water is moving and flowing in the earth, how contaminants move, things like that. This is an experiment we do in the lab where we're actually looking at the movement of contaminants, using really novel imaging tools. And so we're actually, this is SPECT and CT imaging. So the kinds of tools that you would normally use to diagnose cancers and understand where a cancer is in your body, we use to actually image the movement and flow of contaminants in porous media and get 3D images of what's going on inside these materials. And then another area, you know, that more recently become very involved in is kind of geoscience education and helping people understand, you know, how do we actually take this kind of knowledge that we're developing and translate it and use it in classrooms. And so from the, you know, very much digital literacy is a part of that, but one of the main areas that we've been working in is virtual reality and developing tools for virtual reality to help people get into these different places around the world or in different kinds of settings and understand what's happening in those different settings. So it's not quite as exciting of a story as you had, Todd, but you know, hopefully that gives a little bit about my background.
That's excellent. It maybe not as dramatic, but certainly more creative. Over to you now, Hillary. Please introduce yourself to everyone on the call today.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. It is my pleasure, absolute pleasure, to be here with you today. My name is Hillary, and I'm currently a second-year undergraduate student here at MIT, and I study physics, but I'm also minoring in astronomy and philosophy. And I like to call myself an astrophysicist in training / science communicator because those are the two things that I'm most interested about. And let me just flash my story to you for a bit. Can anyone see that?
We can see it.
Yep, nice, thanks. So this is me, and my story of creativity isn't also as dramatic as Todd's, but I'll elaborate more on my other stories later in my later in our conversation. But today I wanted to show you one of the most gratifying moments in my STEM journey so far, where I really dug into my creativity. So for this story started with a specific problem from brilliant.org. It's a website where you solve math problems. And the challenge seemed pretty innocuous, right? Pretty innocent. So can a 10 by 10 grid of cells be covered by 25 of these 1 by 4 pieces? So it seems to be a really simple problem, but it's actually quite tricky. One way you could do that is by brute forcing it, right? Like just try to imagine as many of those 1 by 4 pieces as you can, and then shove it into this 10 by 10 grid and see if it fits, if it covers the whole thing, or if it doesn't. And you can do that. You can solve it very well with brute forcing, but that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And one way I came up with to get around this was by thinking about it in a pretty different way. So this is in the website, and the website has something like of a social media component to it, where people in the community comment their solutions. And to solve this problem, I reimagined the grid as a different kind of grid. So for every group of 4, I imagined it as a group of black squares, and then white squares, so four black squares and 4 white squares, and so on, so like that. And I tiled it that way. And the 1 by 4 pieces, I reimagined them as a piece with 2 black squares and then 2 white squares. So in that way, any way that you place these 1 by 4 squares, so you can see it outlined by the red, it always covers 2 white squares and 2 black squares. And then when you add all of those up, you find that even in the best case scenario where you place 24 dominoes, you are still left with 4 squares which are all black. And that means that since each 1 by 4 always covers 2 black and 2 white, since we have 4 black squares left, that means that this 10 by 10 grid cannot be tiled by 1 by 4 squares. And I felt pretty gratified after coming up with that. And after I posted that, a bunch of people commented on my solutions. They said it was helpful and it was really cool. And then I got a bunch of upvotes on that. And I was really, really happy about that kind of solution. And that was a really gratifying moment to me, showing me that there really is a lot of creative element. There's a lot of creativity behind solving problems in math and science. And in school, we were taught to believe that these are cut and dried methods, very algorithmic, but actually even the algorithms that we come up with have a lot of creative spirit behind them. And to show you just how creative you can get with this problem, there's a solution by another person who tiled the grid in a different way. So he colored it A, B, and C, and then with different colors. And the logic was still the same. He says that every 1 by 4 covers all 4 letters, A, B, C, and D. And since you have letters left, that means that you can't tile it. So it's a really creative way of going through this. And I have a bunch more stories to share today about creativity, but that's just what I wanted to start with today.
Amazing.
And oh yeah, I almost forgot to this story about since Stephen already shared his motivations behind creativity in science and his journey and his motivations on why he does what he does. I also wanted to share my digital literacy story.
When you think of a STEM student, you probably think numbers and lab coats, not magic and creativity. But why not think of both? Hi, my name is Hillary Andales, and I'm from the island province of Leyte in the Philippines. While most children grow up hearing Cinderella stories and tales of magic, I grew up learning about Marie Curie and Charles Darwin. My father loved physics, so naturally I was surrounded by math and science both at home and at school. In first grade, I started joining math competitions. I became known as a math girl. But there was also another boy in my class who was good at art, and he would enter the art competitions. I got called intelligent while he got called creative. I wondered, why couldn't we be both? In 8th grade, I started designing graphics about my favorite show, Doctor Who. At first, I was confused by Photoshop's buttons. But what was first intimidating soon became intuitive. I then created things like t-shirts, infographics, and even a math textbook for kids in my community. At this point, I realized the magic I had to make something that didn't exist before exist. But then, in 2013, I had a big turning point in my life. Typhoon Yolanda struck my home and left over 6,000 people dead. Though we were used to big storms, no one adequately explained the dangers of this one. Had the dangers of a storm surge been communicated properly, more people could have been saved. In that moment, I realized that sharing science in a more understandable way could make a better world. And more importantly, I realized that I can help make that better world. In 2017, I combined my interests in science and communication to compete in the Breakthrough Junior Challenge, where students create videos explaining complex concepts in ways that everyone can understand. My entry about Einstein's theory of relativity won first among 11,000 entries worldwide. I got to stand on the same stage as Morgan Freeman and my favorite scientists. I also received a scholarship to attend MIT, where I'm currently studying and doing research on astrophysics. I also traveled the world sharing digital literacy, inspiration, and of course, science with everyone. So I guess, in a way, I still am the math girl. But now, you can call me creative too.
Amazing story. So that's throwing figurative gasoline on scientific inquiry with much better results than what I had in 6th grade. And so for the second round of questions, let's look for, in some ways at the larger idea of scientific inquiry and creativity. I suppose the widespread myth or misconception might be that scientists are supposed to be so extremely and essentially clinical, objective, perhaps even robotic in their work, hyper logical and uncreative like Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Yet obviously creativity, design, invention, innovation, even serendipity are very important to scientific inquiry. So Stephen, we'll begin with you. What's your perspective on and perhaps firsthand experience with creativity in science or the scientific process or method in general?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say, be well and prosper.
We've all been there.
I think, very much, when people think that, right, it's because we've been taught so much. Like, I don't know how many times, looking at my own kids, we're taught, here's the scientific method. It's this rigid process of something you go through. And I think if you talk to almost any scientist, we know that's not the case, right? We know that there's a lot more to it in terms of thinking about what's actually going on in the world and really using creativity and imagination to understand, what could be happening to explain the observations we see. What science is about, so much more than the scientific method, is asking why, right? Making observations and asking questions, why do we see these things that happen? The scientific method gives us a process, right, to kind of go through and help support the idea that, can we make a robust process to reflect on afterwards, right? And share the knowledge that we have with other people and give the opportunity to, have other people test our work or understand kind of the approach we've taken. But the scientific method in itself is not, I think kind of that driving thing that really is behind science. It's a tool that we use as scientists to help us. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think probably a lot of people don't understand, as scientists, a lot of times when we go to do science, right, or do experiments and things, like, they don't work, right? Because what does that mean when they don't work? I mean, sometimes it's because you did it wrong, right? Like, you made a mistake, you set something up wrong. Sure, that you can fix. But a lot of the other times it's because what you observed or what you saw doesn't align with your mental models, right, that we have constructed as humans about how the world works. And so that is the point, right, where we have to depart from that kind of body of knowledge that we've built up and start to think beyond that and be very creative, right, and think outside the box or whatever it is. Say, well, what are the possibilities, that go beyond what we already know? And that's where, I think that true discovery really starts to happen, is when you really are going kind of beyond what we know and being creative and being imaginative in science. So I'll let Hillary talk about it a little bit, maybe.
Yeah. So I wanted to connect to that idea about the scientific method being actually not exactly how the scientific journey works. If you ask an actual scientist, and even students of science who do experiments in their research projects and all that, it's very nonlinear. And the point that you said about when something doesn't align with our mental model, that means we have to think beyond what we have currently. And I think I remember this one story, which is very apt for this point, which was the story of Einstein, actually. So all of science is basically making sense of the world, right? It's a very creative thing. We have the world in front of us, and as humans, we really want to make sense of it. We want to make order out of it, right? And the creative thing with science is, how can we come up with a very coherent set of principles that models this reality in a very self-consistent way, right? And this model, so back in the 1600s, Newton and Galileo built up this really robust image of the world, right? So they had the laws of motion, and they built up the idea of experimentation to prove any hypothesis. So they set up the whole grounding for science. But in the early 1900s, that model of the world started to break down, and so we saw really weird phenomena that Newton's laws couldn't make sense of, right? And that was the orbit of Mercury around the sun, and the equations of Newton couldn't explain that. And Einstein saw this problem, and he knew he had to think outside of the box to solve that. And one of his really key ideas in doing that was to imagine. He had this really Einstein was actually not the smartest scientist at the time. So many his contemporaries would think that Einstein was not at all very smart. He wasn't very good at math. He wasn't excellent in his physics classes. He wasn't that good. But one thing that Einstein was very good at was he was very extremely creative. He had a really huge mind for thought experiments. He could imagine scenarios that no one else could. And one of his really famous thought experiments, or Gedanken experiments in German, I don't know how to pronounce that, but he asked himself, what if I caught up to a light beam? What would happen if I caught up to a light beam? So we know this kind of concept, right? So when we ride cars every day, we can catch up to when we're on the highway, we can catch up to a car who's speeding beside us. And when we catch up to that car, we're basically stationary with them, right? So they're basically stationary with us. And he imagined that same thing for light. So he knew that light was an object, and he asked what would happen if he could catch up to a light beam. So in that case, he would be stationary to the light beam. He would see this light beam just motionless beside him. And he, after a lot of thought, it turns out that was actually impossible. And that kind of, all of these, after that really mind-blowing thought experiment, that led to the concept that time is actually relative. And that idea of time being relative was actually so almost blasphemous to the people at the time, because Newton built up this idea in scientists and the whole world that time was actually absolute, that there is some kind of a universal clock ticking in the center of the universe telling us what time it is, that is, we tell time with respect to that kind of clock. And after Einstein came up with that thought experiment, with that idea of time being relative, everything just started falling apart. And after that, after Einstein broke down the foundations of science, he built a new and a stronger one, and that is the model of the world that we use today. And this is the story that I think illustrates, best illustrates the value of creativity in science, because in science, we get stuck in centuries of old thinking, and we need someone with a brilliant mind to really come and build that foundation from the ground up again. And that is that's how we came to the world today, how we use why we have GPS and why we have modern technology.
Yeah. One of the challenges, just to build off that for a second, Hillary, that we often have, right, is those people who are really creative, who are going out there and outside the box. People often don't realize their work is often not received well at the beginning, right? Because it's out there, because it just doesn't follow the standard norms. And so kind of thinking out there, being creative is important, but it's also hard and it's a challenge, right? To kind of get those ideas accepted. And it's another reason why communication is so important, right? Because you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't really get those out there in a way that other people can understand them and share them with others, whether it's the public or your fellow scientists, there's no value to those ideas, even if it was revolutionary.
Yeah, we think about the history of science, so many scientists that I don't remember, I should better remember, Copernicus, Galileo, I think, were persecuted for the insights that they tried to bring forward. And so thinking about history, you both have amazing histories and stories about the role of creativity in your work, especially in terms of communicating and teaching complex scientific ideas in creative ways. Just real quickly, for people out there who may not know you, Stephen first, and then Hillary, what are some highlights of your story of creativity in the scientific work you've been doing?
So I don't know that I have the amazing highlights like Hillary will have, because I think Hillary is an inspiration for many of us with what she's been able to achieve and accomplish with the amazing work that she's done already so early in her career. But I think from my perspective, so I will say, coming even to a talk like this, every time I come and talk, at an event for Adobe, I'm excited to do it and happy to do it, because I feel like my contribution is really not that I'm an amazing, communicator or like have done these amazing things, with digital literacy, but that I think that we can really help our students think about, or our faculty think about, how can we restructure what we do so that we can enable our students to become more like Hillary, right? Or to make them feel empowered so that they actually can use tools and tell their stories. And so for me, I certainly, there's a lot of great highlights in terms of, things I've seen where students have produced work for me, and I'd be happy to share some of those. But I'll share a little bit, I think, about, why I feel like it's really important to bring digital literacy, communications, creativity into STEM classrooms. And I think for me, a really huge part of that, as an earth scientist, right, a lot of our work is related to things that happen in the earth. Like I said earlier, we have to go and make observations. And for a lot of students, it's very difficult to take them there. And so things like virtual reality, right, like I was saying earlier, or just good tools to take students out to these other kinds of places. That's one example, I think, of where it's helpful and useful. But outside of just earth science, place-based learning, I think there's really, for me, three key areas where it's important to bring communication into STEM classes. And the three things for me are really kind of assessing learning of students, right? So you can use these kinds of tools to actually have students go back and summarize or help share those mental models, for example, we were talking about earlier. And I can show you some examples of that. That assessment, using it for assessment, it's also, we can bring up things like universal design for learning and kind of the role of metacognition in terms of thinking back across, what do I actually know? How do I know it? And how do I communicate that to someone else, right? So to me, that all kind of falls under this area of assessment. The second main reason I think it's really important to bring these tools in is because of, for all of our students, one of the things we're really struggling and trying to do is help them form an identity, right? Whether that's hopefully as a scientist or whatever, especially in today's world where, you know, diversity is so important, and we really want to encourage people from different backgrounds to come into the sciences. Giving them a pathway to tell their stories in a way that matters to them and is important to them is, I think, critically important. So kind of identity formation is the second reason. The third reason is because I think, you know, it's like Hillary said, communicating science is critically important, right? And so we want students to learn how to be good communicators, whether they're going to go out and, you know, end up working in a company and they need to explain to their boss, you know, some complicated ideas, or a client that they're consulting for, or to their fellow scientists or the general public, you know, whatever that audience is, it's really important for them to learn those tools to be a good communicator, to share that so that they can be good citizens and stewards, you know, for science going forward. So I'll leave it there so Hillary has a chance to add some things to that. But to me, those are really three of the key things I think are important.
Great. So Hillary, some highlights about creativity in your work.
Yeah, sure. So I actually, can I just share my screen to illustrate my the point? So yeah. So for me, the highlight of my story, I think I expressed that most of it in the how do I say this, the video already, but I can go into more of it and just show how that creativity kind of grew in me as I grew up years and years. So in the video, I started really calling myself creative. And that was what Stephen said about identity formation. So before, I only really called myself the math girl. Everybody else called me the math girl. But after I started making Doctor Who fan art, Doctor Who fan graphics, I really started being empowered in creating. And this is what I call magic. And when I say magic in my journey has so far been magical. I say it's magical because I have been able to create something out of nothing. Although that is quite against the conservation laws of the universe, I feel like that is exactly the spirit of creativity, making something out of nothing, making something that wasn't there before. And at first, I created magic for myself. I created things, graphics, just for my own personal pleasure. And then after that, I became even more empowered to use this magic, and I used that for work, for school, for my club work, for all of those things. And then after that, I became even more empowered to create. And at that point, I used that magic for my community. So here I use my creative impulses and my creative desire to make a book for local students who don't have access to the same resources in math training as the richer kids in the bigger cities. And I also use my creative impulses to make this infographic to inform people in my community about how our region would respond to natural disasters, specifically typhoons. Because our region in the Philippines is specifically prone to typhoons. And then after that, because I became even more and more empowered to create something out of nothing, to be a magician in my own right, I reached this turning point in my journey. And that turning point was basically the Breakthrough Junior Challenge, which was the one I mentioned in the video earlier. And this turning point was basically where I used all of my both my creativity and my interest in STEM to make something that totally changed my life. So just a bit of background, this competition is actually the Breakthrough Junior Challenge. It happens annually, and it's a competition for high school students where students have to explain a complex concept in physics, life sciences, or math in 3 minutes in video form. So in the process of making this, I actually had to rack my brain to pick the right topic. And then after I picked the topic that felt right, I had to create creative explanations, creative visualizations, demos, and all of those things in order to deliver the concept properly. I mean, I could have delivered it with math, but people don't like people don't like being shown math for an explainer video. And the thing was, the video had to be understandable to a layman audience, so not a physics student audience. So I had to really dig through the concepts and deliver in a very visual way. So this happened 3 years ago. I posted this in 2017, and I wanted to show you that because this is indeed the highlight of my career so far. So let's start.
Exactly what number is this? She says it's 6. She says it's 9. So who's right? Actually, they're both right. They just saw it differently since they looked at it from different reference frames. Now, what exactly are reference frames? These are just a set of axes for locating space and a clock for measuring time, relative to which you make observations. I'll demonstrate. Once this car starts honking, all 3 observers will record its sound. But sound is a wave. Waves from a moving source, like the car, get bunched up in front and looser at the back. So for our case, those behind the car should hear the loose sound waves, a low pitch, while those in front should hear a high-pitched sound. When I analyzed their recordings, that was exactly what I found. So what sound was the car really making? A high-pitched sound? A medium-pitched sound? Or a low-pitched sound? Well, it was really making all 3 pitches at the same time, each pitch relative to 1 observer. Then what if we had infinitely many observers? Then the car would be making infinitely many sounds, each sound relative to 1 observer. And even if they all disagreed, no one observer is wrong. What each observes is what the sound is. Similarly, if I throw this ball close to the speed of light, its light waves would also get loosened and bunched up, making it appear as different colors. With infinitely many observers, the ball would appear to be all colors at the same time, each color relative to 1 observer. So sound and light are relative. Ever heard of time being relative? Consider a light clock with 2 mirrors and a photon bouncing between them. Every time the photon hits the bottom mirror, it's 1 tick of time. So when I start moving, I see it travel in vertical lines. But from your stationary frame, it travels in V's. So since the photon has to travel a longer distance and the speed of light is constant, each tick takes longer relative to you. So moving clocks run slower, and the faster you run, the slower your clock ticks. So in Olympic races, Usain Bolt is actually the best time traveler. If he ran at 96.8% the speed of light and took 10 seconds to finish a race according to his clock, a stationary judge would record 40 seconds, to which he would obviously object. But their argument would be pointless since time is relative. So the really mind-blowing idea here is that observers in different frames will perceive different versions of the same reality. And every observer's frame is equally valid. So before you start making any observational arguments with others, first imagine yourself observing through their reference frames.
Yep. So that was basically the video that I made, and the process was very involved. So at first, I started with analyzing models. I did my own research into the topic, and then I wrote. And the writing process was the most time intensive, and it's actually also the most creative, the most intense in terms of creativity, because I had to come up with the visuals. I had to come up with the words that I had to say in order to fit it into 3 minutes and in order to deliver it in a simple way. And then after that, I did the production, which was technical but also creative. I actually edited and made the animations all by myself. Before this competition, I had 0 experience in YouTube. I had to learn everything from scratch through YouTube tutorials, and it seems that I succeeded because after the competition, I was selected to be first out of 11,000 participants worldwide that year. And that actually just changed my life completely. And after that, I became really interested in, so this is also a picture of me doing the editing work and during the awarding ceremony, which happened at NASA. And then after that, I really just started getting an interest in science communication. And after this competition, I actually heard someone say that science is boring, intimidating, and useless. And after hearing that, I was incredibly shocked, because for me, my entire life, science was just this amazing, amazing way of obtaining knowledge about the universe. But for someone to say that it was boring, intimidating, and useless, that was a real shock to me. And from that moment on, I was committed to sending the message that science is in fact not boring, intimidating, and so from ever since then, I've been creating magic for the world through my work in science communication. So I've traveled all over the Philippines, and I also spoke at the United Nations once about science communication. And basically, I just do a lot of work in engaging people about the value of science. And this, in the time of the pandemic, I've been doing that a lot more these days, because, as I said earlier, science communication at the most critical points is life and death. And especially in this time of the pandemic, with the confusions in mask wearing, in vaccination, in vaccine hesitancy, and all of that, I'm really reaching out to people in the Philippines. I'm hopefully breeding a new generation of science communicators who are my age, and empowering all of us to really become science communicators in our own right. And yeah, so that's really how I've been using creativity in my STEM journey so far.
It's oh, you're muted, Todd. I was going to just say, both of the examples, Stephen, we've chatted before, you presented, and Hillary sharing your story. The thing I find really compelling about science communication that really people can really take in is that when it's presented in the context of their life, the examples that you show, there's a deeper understanding of accepting the hypothesis that the convincing argument is put in front of you around science. And so the visual way that people are communicating these days on any platform becomes like the mode that people want to accept the truth or the information they're seeing. Because today the written word can be, misleading, and the visual way that people see the written word seems to be the way they want to take it all in and latch onto their beliefs. And so both of the examples Stephen, you showed an example before, the moment it goes to the relatable way to take in the science and the data, it really sticks with the audience. Even the video that you showed before, Stephen, and other presentations of those students talking about water conservation in a humorous, really unconventional way, is someone like me who doesn't understand water conservation to really understand it much clearer.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are important points. And I think one of the things that we know, right, from science communication is that when you want people to understand something or even change the way they think about something, just presenting a bunch of data and facts is not necessarily going to do that, right? And so really that's where kind of getting stories across, having people, understand it from a, let's say, human perspective, right, is, I think an important thing to help people relate and understand and start to reflect and think themselves about, what does it mean to them, or understand. I mean, one of the areas we're interested in is environmental justice, right? And so having people understand another person's experience and why, for example, contaminant problem impacting a marginalized community is important to them when they live in some affluent community. That's a hard thing to do. And so having those stories is really important. So one thing I did want to pick up on, maybe if it's okay and we have time, is some of what Hillary is obviously an inspiration, right? Like the model of what I wish I could be like Hillary. Definitely you inspire me, Hillary, for sure. But But one of the things that really strikes me, I think is important when I think about kind of what you've done in your work, and I look at it from the perspective of an educator, and what I do in my classroom and what I might be able to translate from your experience into my classroom is some of that process, that you shared, right, of going through things, the research, right, the development of a plan, the looking at models, the writing, because that whole process is very much like a metacognitive kind of process, right? That's a reflection on what do I know, right? What do I think is important about the things that I know? And then how do I share that with someone else and explain it to someone else? And so I think that kind of idea of that reflection on the knowledge in a way to bring it together is a really important part of what we talk about. And if it's okay, can I share 3 quick examples?
Please do.
Yes.
From classes, because one of them is kind of funny, and then the other ones I think are actually of interest to people. But this one I'm going to share first is actually an assignment I gave my class where I asked them to, can you guys see these shoes?
You can.
So I actually ended up getting these an opportunity to get, Vans has their own design your own shoe thing, and I got these free coupons for designing your own shoes. So I challenged my class to conceptualize and show, how can you put this entire class on a shoe, right? And so then I gave them the coupon so they could go do it and print out the shoe and wear it around our class on their feet. But the idea there was really that thinking back about what do you think is important about this class, right? What are the concepts and things that you've learned that you think are important enough to put on this one little shoe that you would be able to share with other people? So maybe a little less funny of an example is an assignment, that I give in class where we talk about, it's a water resources class. Talk about the West Bank, and water in the West Bank is one issue, and their assignment is to make a social media post sharing and discussing issues. They take the perspective of either they're a Palestinian or Israeli, and there's different roles that they have that they're trying to convince the world about the issues that they're facing. And what's important to me is not actually what's on this social media post. I don't grade the social media post really unless it's like just terrible, but what they really do is we assess the process of what their thinking was going into creating that social media post. So they have to write up an analysis talking about what did I actually put in that post and why. And just highlighted a part of one of these students' analyses here to kind of have them do that reflective step. So it's not just creating something, but it's really having them do that metacognitive reflection on why they're creating it. And I think that can be applied in any kind of classroom setting, right? About the choices they're making and why they're making those choices, regardless of the topic. And the third quick example I want to share is actually kind of from an example or an assignment I created for the Adobe Master Teachers Program, where it was this idea of how do you build a conceptual model to share your understanding of something with someone else. And so it was a 3-step process, basically 3 assignments that we created for this. And the first one was basically, creating, like a mental model of or documenting all the information that's in your brain about this particular topic. So in this particular case, it was developing estuary. The assignment was thinking about estuary water quality. So what things impact water quality in our coastal regions. And so this is really like the crazy, I'm going to sit down and write everything down I possibly know, essentially like a brainstorming step. And the next step is then organizing that right into a model that tells me, well, how are all these things really related and how do they influence each other? And this is actually the step at which, I might actually be able to take something like this and put it into a computer model, for example, to really share or explain like the details of these processes and how they're interconnected. But, of course, that wasn't the assignment here. This next step of the assignment was to take that kind of more detailed model and put it into Illustrator and develop, well, here's how I would share this with other people, right? And actually the different kinds of things that I think are important to really highlight these different elements. So going through that process, it goes from like crazy, everything in my brain, to trying to organize it down into what are the important parts and how are they related and how do I explain this system to, okay, now what do I do to actually share this, with an audience? And this was kind of designed for more of a technical audience, but again, it really simplifies those ideas. So I thought that was worth sharing, just to kind of show that process of like mental model development and kind of using creativity and communications as a tool to help students both document their understanding of the content and also have them do that, self-reflection process.
It's interesting. The process you just outlined is literally the chapters in my textbook about first-year writing. And so in the chat pod, there've been a lot of great comments about how people are seeing almost completely seamless connections between everything we're talking about. And so, it seems like we're coming together on almost a consensus definition of creation, of making, as what Hillary defined as the magic of imagining or remixing or creating something that didn't exist before. And so much of it, I believe, is connection, is not just connecting data, but connecting data to people in a specific context for a specific purpose. And so I'm just kind of interested, if Hillary, if you have a specific question you'd like to ask Stephen, and vice versa, and we have just a few minutes left. If there's anyone out there in the audience who'd like to quickly post a question for our panelists in the chat pod, we'd love to have some interaction going that way. Hillary, what are your thoughts about defining creativity? And if you could put Stephen on the spot and ask him a question, what might that be?
I'm on the spot.
Yeah. No, I actually really like all the points and the evolution of the the first draft to the actual visual presentation, the final product. I really like that. But I really like the point earlier that you raised about identity formation and how important that was.
Mm-hmm.
You have a specific story about identity formation that really struck you in, basically just hammered the point to you that creativity has a lot to do with identity formation.
And a reference frame from the position from which you are observing an issue or a problem.
So that's a tough question, actually, what you're asking. So I'm trying to think about a case, this identity formation. I think actually the best case specific, I can think of a lot of examples thinking about identity formation in STEM and experiences that help build that. But I think the best example, actually, I can think of many examples now that we're talking about. See, it takes a few minutes to get it rolling. But I think still one of the best examples that I have that I think was important was the video that Seb alluded to earlier. So, in my class, I would have this assignment where students would have to kind of pick a problem they thought was important about water, and they would have to go and design, do a whole campaign to get the information out there, make a website, make a video, do a social media post, make a virtual reality experience. So it was a lot of work. And these guys that I had in my class were kind of like the slackers of the class. I shouldn't be saying this because we're recording this, but they weren't the most outstanding guys in the class. They weren't the students I would have identified right at the beginning and said, these guys are the star pupils of the class. Maybe let me put it that way. And all semester long, at the end of class, I'd be like, hey guys, what are you doing? What are you working on? Because I was super worried about them and what they were actually going to produce. And by the end of the semester, we got so on our, instead of a final exam, we had a red carpet day where we did showings of all the videos and stuff. And I was like, okay, who wants to go first? And these guys were like, yeah, we want to go first, hands up right away. And they were so excited because what they had done, is created this video that, as Seb said, they just put so much of themselves into, and it became so personal. And they went from being kind of like these slackers in the class to being like the stars of the class, and no one else wanted to go after them after that. So I think that's such a good example. If we have time later, I'd be happy to share that video, but I don't know if we have enough time or not.
Yeah, that was an amazing story. Yeah.
Cool. And so, yeah, we're almost done here. There's a question in the chat pod. What suggestions do you have for students who might be overwhelmed by technology?
Do you want to go first, Hillary, or do you want me to go?
You can go first.
I think for me, the way, just thinking about how we've implemented Adobe, for example, in our classes at the university, very much, I think it's what you don't want to do is present all the tools first, right? Like, here's all the buttons, because that's super overwhelming. It's super overwhelming for me. I think the real key is to say, what is the thing you want to produce, right? Let's focus on that product and get that done first. And so, like, we can guide them and help them by choosing the tool that's the easiest one to make the product. So I often kind of take students through like Adobe Spark first, right? Because it's so easy to use, like literally anybody can use Adobe Spark. And then maybe if we're thinking about videos, going into Rush, because they can start to, think about how they're putting things together and going that next little step. And then like introducing them to Premiere Pro after that is kind of the approach I take. You certainly can jump in, I guess, and show them the tools, right from the beginning, say in Premiere Pro, but I do feel like it's kind of still kind of overwhelming for me. And I'm like, I don't know, where did I find this thing? So I think for me, it's about that progression. And I take the same approach. I'll tell you right now, I'm writing a series of tutorials to teach people how to use Python, which is a programming language. And so same kind of approach. It's like, what do I need to know right now to do something that I want to achieve versus, okay, let me teach you all this stuff that's not actually what you're going to use until 3 weeks later. So for me, it's really that giving them the support to learn a little bit at a time.
I can, I'll add to that, Stephen. John Homovic from Clemson University taught me that failing fast is one of the best ways to deal with your feeling of being overwhelmed by technology. And him giving the students the ability to fail as quickly as possible so that they can build up confidence and then, return back to improving where they're at. Because most of his students in his rhetoric class have never made a video. And the introduction is, we know your first one's not going to be that great. We know your second one's not going to be that great. And so it's okay. The production values don't matter. You're learning through communicating your ideas and thoughts through this medium that is really most important. And ultimately, at the end of the class, they build up the skills. So if you think of like, how are they overwhelmed? Then I think of my son, who you just described, he's 20, Hillary's age, and he only wants to know the little piece of technology to kind of get his thought out and communicate. Because many times I come and say, hey, do you need some help understanding Illustrator? They go, no, I don't need a tutorial. I just want to get these 5 things done. How do I do it? Because he already has an idea of how he wants to do it. And he'll find his attitude to being overwhelmed is, I'm just going to use the 3 things I need to get done. And the other stuff is, I'll get to it later. I don't need it until I actually need to go do it. So I don't know, Hillary, if your experience is the same, because you didn't know this technology before you made your video. And you had probably a sense of being overwhelmed initially to try to, how do you learn After Effects? If anyone knows After Effects, it's like flying a cockpit in the cockpit of 747.
Yeah, actually, it feels like a cockpit with all the buttons. It was really terrifying at first, but I think just adding to what Seth and Stephen said, for me, when I was building my video, I was seeing the tool for the first time and I was reasonably very overwhelmed, but I knew what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted the frames to look like. So I basically just went onto YouTube and searched for tutorials, like how to make a squiggly line move in After Effects, how to make this thing transparent and all of those things after that. And I basically just learned the things that I wanted to do, and basically just adding on to what Seb said about his story about his son, and just building up from there. And also another thing with technology is that there is just so much hype in using the most innovative tool out there. And one story that comes to mind is the hype behind Notion. I don't know if you've heard of Notion. It's this popular productivity app. You put all your notes in there. There's a whole cult following behind the app. And people build their own productivity systems on that. And I had a lot of friends using it. I saw a lot of YouTubers using it. Basically, it was this whole hype thing. And I started using it myself too. I started following their tutorials. I started following all their templates and made my own thing. And it was very high tech, very innovative in terms of basically what Notion did was basically just a to-do list, but it made it so complicated. And I actually did not use it, not once. I built a template, but I used it 0 times. And so after that, I just reverted to my own system, which was just Google Keep, basically, or a sticky note, or like this whiteboard beside me. I just wrote it down and then checked it off at the end of the day, and that was it. That was my system. And so yeah, the for me, what I learned from that is to just not always be carried away by the newest frameworks or by the newest technology. Just stick to the system that works for you. And if your current system doesn't fit your needs, then that's the time you innovate. But don't get carried away by the hype, because these days there's just so much hype with the most innovative tool.
And just to add to that, I think the really important underlying message there of what Hillary is saying is that it's not the tool, it's the message, right? Or the underlying content that you're trying to get to that's important. And the tool is just, what makes it fancier, extra engaging or whatever, but it's that fundamental story you're trying to get out.
I agree. And so we're at the top of the hour, and we're going to gently wrap up here. First, we want to thank everyone for being here. And I'd like to answer Paul's question just real briefly by suggesting that if you're focusing on kind of the things that Stephen's talking about, what's the outcome? What's the learning outcome? And not what's the device or technology itself. We see the same kind of process that we've seen all day today, from famous scientists in history to what the latest students are doing in their classes. And that is, you have a need. You have a problem that needs creative solutions to solve. And so innovators and researchers and scientists have always tried to figure out how to use the latest technology to solve these problems. And so it's the famous maxim, necessity or constraint is the mother of invention. It's what, in some ways, what prompts people to find solutions and to advance knowledge in all fields. And so we thank you for being part of the Creative Campus community and joining us today. We hope you will join again. We will be sending out a follow-up email with as many links as we can corral from today's conversation, so that we will share those with you through email. We encourage you also to look at what the Creative Campus program is doing, and links to that will be available to you as well in the follow-up email. We especially thank both of our special superstar guests today, Stephen Moysey and Hillary Andales. Thank you so much for being with us today. You were magic. You created something very meaningful, at least speaking for myself, out of something as empty as a Zoom room. And so thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Hillary.
The whole audience.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Time for refills.
Time for refills for the coffee. Have a great day, everybody.